Hello and welcome back to another edition of YCT Matters. This is Carol Platt Liebau, president of Yankee Institute, and today we are delighted to be joined by Professor Gary Rose of Sacred Heart University. And Professor Rose is one of the longtime political experts here in Connecticut. He has been discussing American politics, constitutional law, and all kinds of different things related to Connecticut and the United States political system for 40 years. And in addition to his teaching, he's published 14 books on subjects including Connecticut government, the American presidency, constitutional law, and presidential elections. He is quoted everywhere, and he frequently provides political analysis for local, state, and national media. He did publish a book on the 2016 election, actually an 800-page volume that tracked the contest from 2013 to the day of the election. And the name of that book is Haywire, a chronology of the 2016 presidential contest. So, Professor Rose, welcome and thank you for joining us today on YCT Matters.
Well, I'm glad to be here. Good to see you, Carol.
Well, thank you so much. And so we may get around to talking a little bit about the contest itself, but one of the things that I think is really interesting this time of year is all of us hear about polls and polling and what the polls say. And it seemed to me it might be interesting for us to talk a little bit about the science of polling and how you can look at a poll and evaluate what it says intelligently and whether the poll is actually giving us credible information. And so what a layperson can do when we see, a poll says this or that about a state election or a federal election, how do we know if the poll is really actually telling us something that we should be believing or whether it's kind of a junk poll? Because there are junk polls out there, aren't there?
Well, there certainly are. One has to be very careful of what polls are doing these days, because they are really a constant presence now in American politics. So one always has to be cautious about reading the results of a poll. Most people, it's true, they just kind of go on the basis of what a poll says without, doing a deeper dive into who did the poll, or what the purpose of the poll was, and the sample of the poll. And that's really important. So a couple things that people need to be aware of to begin with is what kind of questions were asked and how were they asked. And there are such a thing as what we call value-laden questions in polling that one needs to be very careful of. That is where you kind of structure a question in a way where you lead your respondent to a particular answer.
So what would be an example of a value-laden question? Let's just do, without necessarily picking a side in the presidential contest, because everybody knows it, everybody's hearing about it all the time. What would be an example of a value-laden question in presidential polling?
Yeah. Well, let's just take President Trump, for example. And you could say in a question, do you think President Trump was responsible for the January 6th insurrection? A question like that. Now, what's somebody going to say about that, really? And already you're suggesting that the president was directly involved in some way. And so that would be an example of just leading a respondent, to a particular answer, or maybe another one is, don't you think President Trump could have done more to stop the insurrection? That could be a value-laden type of question, and then you have a yes or no or maybe response after that.
Okay, so that's a value-laden question. Then you look at sample size, for example, correct?
Yes. Yeah, sample size is always iffy. I mean, you got to be a little careful there. You don't need actually an enormously large sample, however, to draw some type of generalization about where the electorate is. So it's not necessarily sample size. I mean, yes, you have to have a healthy sample, but a lot of good polls work off of maybe, 1,200, 1,500 people. And from that you can actually generate some type of statement. The most important thing within a poll, and again, it's important for people to look at this, is the sample representative of the country. If you want to make a general statement about the electorate, then you want to make sure that you have a equal distribution of people who perceive themselves as Democrats, Republican, and unaffiliated.
And
And you
that's
look at
where,
that.
and that's one of the things that I find extremely fascinating because that's where a pollster's expertise and judgment really come into play, correct? Because
Yes,
there's a certain amount of weighting that goes on to make sure a pollster has gotten a representative sample of what the electorate is really thinking and saying, correct?
that's right. That's right. And I've been involved in some polling projects, and you can actually, the laws of probability are at work in putting a sample together. And you can actually do that at times based on, like, if you're going to do a phone interview, what they call random digit dialing, where, random digit dialing, sometimes the laws of probability suggest that you will probably end up with a representative sample. And you don't necessarily have to pick and choose who your respondents are. You can do random, polling, random sampling, and you are supposed to, if you do it right, you are supposed to end up with a sample that is reflective of what you're trying to poll. And so, yeah, it's that's another thing too. You always want to look at when a poll is announced. What is the distribution? Did in fact the poll generate a healthy random sample and
So
a healthy distribution of the electorate?
So, say that you take a poll and then it ends up that you have a sample that, for example, say that, I don't know, 12% of the people in the country, just to generalize, are African American. But you
Mhm.
end up with a polling sample where you only got 5% of your respondents as African American.
Yes, right.
Then that has to be adjusted, does it not?
That's
And how
right.
is
That's
that
right.
done?
Well, then, at that point, you really would not want to use your sample. You have to do it again. And I've been involved with some polls where we have to do it again because it did not generate the sample that you were hoping to get. But as you say, and if you had a poll where 5% of the respondents were African American or Hispanic, you would have an issue with that because now you're not really tapping into a proper distribution of views among that demographic group. That's so important too in polling is to have the demographic groups in our society based on the percentage that we know, that are based on census figures are reflected in your poll. And so some polls, it's true, you have to discard them, and if in fact they're published, you don't want to really put much stock in them.
So, how is weighting done? Is there such a thing as weighting in polls? And then how is that process done?
Well, the weighting really is more based on just the way you do the poll, and that is really more is it going to be done through the phone? Is it going to be done by calling people and talking to them directly? Is it going to be done in social media? And so, I mean, the weighting issue really gets us more into a mathematical type of probability, and so that's the best I can answer that. It's kind of complex, actually. Yeah.
So, is there ever a time when the poll isn't redone, where in fact the sample size is adjusted based on people's understanding of what certain groups or certain demographics, for example, um, the way certain income levels have tended to skew in the past, and then the the results are adjusted to reflect that, or is it simply the poll simply scrapped and done again? And then
Yeah.
how does that work in terms of expense?
Normally, well, yeah, that's the problem. I mean, we do some polling here from our university. Most recently, they do work now on sustainability and social justice, but for a number of years, we actually had political polls. And so, yeah, and I would often comment on those polls too, but at times I had seen some polling that was done and it just I knew that it wasn't a reflection of what the district here in the Fairfield County was or the whatever we were polling the state, and it had to be done again. And that was the thing because you have a whole bunch of people that are making phone calls and interviewing people, and maybe you just ended up with a wrong sample, and so it's not really as scientific as you might think, but you do have to scrap the poll. That's true. If you end up with a poll where you have 75% of the people are Republicans, you have a real problem with interpreting that. And so something went awry and it wasn't done properly. And so the poll has to begin over again.
So it is never the case, are you saying, that pollsters go ahead and just simply adjust what their understanding is about um, um, they never weight polls, then they always take their results based only on demographics or whatever when they go ahead and they just scrap polls. They never go ahead and sort of adjust their known understanding of what previous polls or previous, in other words, they never factor in um, other things to make sure that they have adjusted for a sample size that doesn't come in quite right?
Yeah, okay, if I understand your question correctly, yeah, they will look at the demographic breakdown of the poll, and if the demographics don't reflect what they know the census figures are, then the poll is considered contaminated a little bit. And so you have to do it again to try to get an accurate sample. That's really what you do.
I mean, yes.
Because these people release these polls to the media, and that's very important. Yeah.
Yes, no, they do release them to the media. I was just curious because, I had understood that occasionally, if people can't get quite the optimal percentages, that sometimes the polls are just sort of the statistics are just sort of corrected a little bit with what past experience has shown to be the orientation or the if you don't get quite the right number of women, not by a radical
Right.
amount, but
Right.
and we all understand that, for example, women 18 to 36 in Fairfield County with a certain, income level or above are very strongly pro-choice, but you didn't get that certain number and that's what you're polling on, you can just sort of adjust for that a little bit. But you're saying that really never happens.
I've never been involved in an adjustment of a poll. So if in fact people are doing that to adjust their numbers, um, that raises some questions in my mind about the validity of the poll.
Okay. And so when you look at crosstabs of a poll, how do you do that? How does one look at the crosstabs of a poll intelligently?
Yeah, well, those are all the questions that are asked, and you would hope that when you do your polling, you not only have questions, but then there has to be a section in the poll where you ask the respondent to give some personal information about themselves. And so you got to find out what the person's race is, the religion. People are a little hesitant at times to say what their income is. That's always kind of a iffy type of question to ask. But you do ask questions often at the end of the poll. After you have your policy questions, then you start asking the demographic questions in order to generate that. And then you have in your poll all of that data, and then you can do your cross tabulations through the statistical models on your poll where you can break it down by age, race, religion, et cetera, et cetera. And that's where it really gets interesting in my mind, more so than the way just the general poll has gone. I love to look at crosstabs and stuff and to see what's going on out there.
And so can you help us understand why that's so interesting and what you look for?
Well, because different demographic groups vote a certain way. and that's what makes it so interesting in my mind is like, okay, if you break it down by women, how do women feel about the economy versus men? How do Catholics feel about abortion compared to, say, Protestants and people of the Jewish faith? Is there a difference there? And so when you really get in with the crosstabs, age, how does age relate to policy perspectives? And so that, to me, that is so fascinating because then you can also put charts together if you're doing research with it to show, that as age increases, support for certain positions increase or decrease, whatever. And so I love the cross tabulations of a poll because then you can, and when you have those demographic differences, you can also then you can't predict exactly how people are going to vote, but you can then start to see perhaps some patterns in terms of what's to come in the election and how you can make statements about women voters, male voters, young voters, et cetera, et cetera. And so the demographics to me are just fantastic. When you have a large body of that to work with, then you do your cross tabulations on each policy issue, and it's fascinating. I love it.
Yeah. So, Professor Rose, when you're looking at a poll and you're evaluating whether or not it's credible, you had said something about between 1,200, I think, some number.
Yeah.
Is there a certain number of people that a poll has to speak with before you can really start trusting that its results are credible?
Well, all the polling that I've been involved in and some of the courses I've had years and years ago, um, there was always this notion that you should have at least a minimum of 1,000 people. But at the same time, though, I know that, that we used to have the Roper poll here in Connecticut that was housed at UConn. And if I remember correctly, and I used some of those polls in my own research, I think they were working off of like 500 people. And so, but normally in order to get, again, as you were mentioning, Carol, the demographic part of it, you got to have at least, normally a minimum of 1,000, 1,200 people to kind of get to that. And
Yeah.
so that to me is interesting. I mean, I like the Pew research that's out there. They have huge samples of people, but you don't need that many people at times to make a generalization about where things are heading.
And so when you have, polls that are generally credible polls and they have samples of over 1,000
Yeah.
people, and they are presumably then getting a proper demographic representation in accordance with the census and everything like that, Professor Rose. How is it? How is it then that different people are getting different results? I mean, is it the questions they're asking? They're just simply asking different questions?
Well, I
Or, I
think
mean, you would think that some questions are relatively standard. In other words, are you going to vote for Donald Trump or are you going to vote for Kamala Harris?
yeah.
And, we get obviously some disparities between the two.
Well, the answer to that is just the nature of the sample that you finally have generated. Although if you notice, a lot of the polls these days are pretty close. They are saying the same thing in terms of this election. Not too many polls are different, and they're showing such a tight race now between the two candidates. And I notice poll after poll, kind of comes in around the same. And so but if you do have a wide variation, a lot of that could have to do again with getting back to the very first point I raised about the way the question is phrased. Yeah, or maybe there is sometimes they say like the Rasmussen poll, you often hear criticisms about that. They say that it oversamples Republicans, and I don't know if that's a legitimate claim or not, but nevertheless, you've often heard that. And then sometimes you hear about the CNN polls that oversamples Democrats, and so yeah, but nevertheless, I'm pretty confident that most of the polling that's being done these days by the big firms are doing a pretty good job of it. And because the results are very similar, very similar.
How do pollsters account for, in the past, there's been a discussion of the shy Trump voter effect. And pollsters say that they feel like they've corrected for that in this election cycle. How would you correct for an effect like that?
Yeah, I've heard that too. I'm not so certain how you do that. I mean, I was talking a while back to a Trump voter, and I know this person is voting for Trump, and we talked about it. And I said, if you were asked by a pollster how you're going to vote, what would you say? And this individual said, I would say I'm still undecided. Now that's a Trump voter. That's the shy Trump voter that you're talking about. And so I'm not so certain that, and we know that in 2016, that was a big factor, and that what explains how Trump broke the blue wall there to everyone's surprise. So I don't know how they if they go deeper into trying to get the person to admit something, but I don't really quite. I've heard that now that maybe they've adjusted that, but I am still of the notion that there is as you say, a shy Trump voter out there that has not been detected in these polls. So I don't know how you can do that. If somebody is unwilling to say that they're going to vote for Donald Trump in a poll, I don't know how you tease that out of them. I really don't. So
And
I'm not convinced that that's been found.
and so just to circle back to what we were talking about before, you said, you know, maybe you adjust for that. So what kind of adjustments do people make to polls?
Uh, well, I think that if you don't end up with a proper distribution of party affiliation, proper demographics, as we were talking about, then you don't want to manufacture data or manufacture material on your poll. So quite frankly, a poll has to be reconducted in order to generate what you were hoping to get. And so I know of polls that have been scrapped, as we were saying before, because it did not generate what lent itself to a proper generalization.
Do pollsters ever adjust polls? Is that what you're talking about with this shy Trump vote?
Do they adjust that? If they are, then I think that lends itself to a legitimacy question. And
I
so,
agree. That's what I'm
yeah,
trying to get to
yeah,
is,
yeah,
as people try and assess the credibility and the legitimacy of polls, that's what I think is a question in a lot of people's mind. That's what we were talking about before,
yeah,
is, you know, um, are polls trustworthy? Do
ah,
adjustments get made?
yeah.
And
Well,
what kind of adjustments get made if they do get made?
yeah,
Because,
if an
I
adjustment is,
understand, that, you know, e- perhaps ethically and certainly ideally, you have a situation where if you don't get your distribution in accordance with the census, you scrap the poll. But in the real world, obviously, sometimes even with a random distribution of telephone numbers, that
well,
isn't going to happen. And sometimes people just don't have the resources to scrap a poll, but they certainly don't want to go back and say, you know, gosh,
yeah.
we're just not going to be able to use this. So, are statistical adjustments ever made? And if so, how is that done? That's kind
Well,
of what I'm trying to get at.
yeah, I know what you're getting at, sure. But I guess I just have to go on the basis of the polls that I've worked with, and I never have known a poll that was adjusted in order to accommodate, a prescribed figure. And so, if in fact that is being done, it's done in a way that I'm not familiar with, quite frankly. Yeah, I'm really not. And so, um, and I think that would, to me, to my mind, that would raise legitimacy questions of a poll if people are adjusting their data in order to say that it's representative. I think that's a serious issue.
I see.
Yeah,
Um, so, you know, we've heard in this election cycle that there are, there are the polls that we read in the newspaper, and then there are the polls that they say are internal polls.
yeah,
And obviously, everyone treats the internal polls as being somewhat more credible than the polls that we read in the newspaper. And
well,
can you help us understand why that might be?
well. Actually, Carol, the internal polling is, to my mind, and what I've always been kind of taught is that you have to be a little careful of what the internal polling is doing, more so than the other polls that we're talking about. Because these polls, the internal polling is done by the consultants themselves of the candidate. And, often you hear that the internal polling of a candidate is stronger than say what the general polling is showing. And one sometimes has to question what the motivation for that is. Is it trying to build momentum for a candidate? Is it skewing the results to make the candidate feel that he or she is more viable than they really are? And so the internal polling, at least going back to, my own training a little bit on polls, and I'm not a pollster, but I do know something about them, is that those polls are not as accurate and as objective, and that sometimes they're even what they call push polls, where
Yes,
you kind of get people to,
I know they
you know,
can be. I just had, my understanding had been that sometimes these internal pollsters, the campaigns are willing to spend more money on the polls because it's going to guide them in terms of what their strategy needs to
yeah,
be. And so, there's sometimes the resources to dive more deeply into certain areas versus, polls that now media organizations that may be slightly more strapped for funds are able to afford to do. So you can get, sort of deeper into issues, spend a little more money on things, and therefore get a bigger sample
yeah.
and a closer read on certain issues.
Well, yeah, but what candidates like to do often is use the internal polling to really,
Oh,
build
sure, drive a narrative.
yeah, drive a narrative, just as
Yeah.
you say. And that's why the internal polling itself sometimes can be a little suspect because you go, wow, that doesn't really seem to square with what, the major polls are showing. And so, um, you know, I've always felt that the internal polling is done to move voters in a certain way more than perhaps what the larger polls are showing. So I'm a little suspect of internal polling, and as you say, to drive a narrative, and that's not what a poll should do.
Yeah,
But
of course.
yeah.
Of course. Um, Going forward, is there anything else that you think we should be mindful of or looking at as we look at a poll, in these final, as things sort of start to wind down in this presidential campaign? I mean, I know trend lines are one thing that is sort of important. Can you talk to us about what a trend line is and what it can tell us?
Well, it's interesting with the polls that are being done, and there is such little movement from one poll to another these days. And um, I think that in this particular case, because the country is so locked in, and I think, that I don't want to use the word that the election's already baked, but it doesn't seem as if a different poll, from whatever organization is going to be finding anything different than, say, what was discovered 2 to 3 weeks ago. And so, yes, I mean, I think it's great that we do polling right up to the end. It's important to know that, but and that's what you should do. If that's what your question is, you should poll as close to the election as possible. But in this particular election, unlike previous elections, the electorate's not moving at all. And we have seen movement before in previous elections, but in this one, the country is so divided, so polarized, and that people are really locked in, and not much is changing. No matter when the poll, either if it was done, 3 weeks ago, or if it's going to be done this week, I think we're probably going to see the same results.
Mhm.
That because the electorate is very hardened right now on how they're going to vote, and all of the press conferences, the meetings, the Kamala Harris's interview with 60 Minutes, all of that, none of that changed anything, and even the debate, despite the fact that Trump did not have the best day up there, and she did, nothing moved really. And so the timeline's fine, and you should poll up as close as possible, but I don't think you're going to see much change. You really not.
Is there anything else you advise people to be watching for other than some completely unforeseeable black swan event in these waning days?
Yeah, you mean the
Other than to
October,
expect the unexpected, or
the
some
October
completely
surprise.
unexpected event could change everything. Is
That's
there
going
anything
to
else
move
we should be
things.
looking for?
Yeah, oh, the October surprise. Everybody always says there's one coming, but I don't know what's coming that people are anticipating. Um, no, you know, I still think that there's something that might happen with the vice presidential candidates that are out there, and even though people vote for the top of the ticket, there are interesting statements and developments going on with both J.D. Vance and Tim Walz that I think voters should start watching more carefully. And, there's always a strong chance that a vice president's going to be a president someday. And so we've had quite a few presidents who at one time were a VP. And so I would say, that's something maybe we should watch for. And if there's any type of development that might move this election, it could come from that.
Well,
And
thank
so
you.
that's something to watch for, I would say. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And Professor Gary Rose from Sacred Heart, an elections expert on American presidency, constitutional law, and the American electoral system. We are very grateful to you for having spent this time to talk with us about polling and how to look at polls and how to look at crosstabs and how to think about them. And we're grateful for your time today.
My pleasure, Carol. Thank you.
Thank you. And this is Carol Platt Liebau, president of Yankee Institute. Thank you for being with us. We look forward to having you with us again on the next edition of YCT Matters.